In 1903, twin siblings Phoebe and Wilbert Oats made a decision that violated every law of nature and morality. They married each other in a secret ceremony deep in the Oregon wilderness, convinced they were preserving something pure. But what they created in the darkness of their isolated property wasn't purity. It was a decade-long experiment in human degradation that would produce 7 children, claim at least 2 lives, and prove that some sins are so profound they poison the very ground they touch. This is the story of how isolation and obsession transformed 2 people into monsters who justified the unjustifiable, who documented their own descent into evil with scientific precision, and who never, even in their final days, understood the horror of what they had done. The Oats property sat 15 miles from Crater Lake, Oregon, accessible only by a dirt road that snaked through forest so dense that sunlight struggled to reach the ground even at noon. Waldo Oats had purchased this 200-acre plot in 1885, dreaming of building a timber empire from the ancient trees that surrounded his land. He constructed a sturdy 2-story house from logs he cut himself and built a sawmill that provided the family's income. But Waldo's dreams died the same day his wife did. She passed during childbirth in 1884, leaving him with twin infants, Phoebe and Wilbert, and a grief so consuming that he retreated into himself. The nearest neighbors lived 3 miles away, and Waldo made no effort to maintain connections with them or anyone else. He raised his children in almost complete isolation, their only companions each other and the silent trees that surrounded their property. Phoebe and Wilbert grew up pale as ghosts, with nearly white blonde hair and eyes so blue they looked almost colorless in certain light. From their earliest years, they displayed a connection that made the few visitors to the property deeply uncomfortable. They finished each other's sentences, communicated in glances, developed a silent language of gestures that excluded their father entirely. They moved through the house like shadows of the same person, always together, always watching each other with an intensity that seemed unhealthy even to Waldo's isolated mind. In 1895, when the twins were 11, Waldo made one of his rare trips to town and brought them along. Other children ridiculed Phoebe for her extreme paleness and shy behavior, mocking her silence and the way she clung to her brother. Waldo witnessed his daughter's humiliation and made a decision that would seal their fate. The family didn't need outside society, he decided. They would be sufficient unto themselves. From that day forward, visits to town became even more infrequent. The twins spent their adolescence seeing almost no one except their father and each other. They developed their own routines, their own rituals, their own way of understanding the world that bore little resemblance to normal human development. When they turned 18 in 1902, Waldo began noticing behaviors that disturbed even his isolated sensibilities. The twins spent hours locked in the attic, going through books that had belonged to their paternal grandfather, a man the community had considered eccentric before his death. They communicated almost entirely through looks and subtle gestures. They had begun sleeping in the same room, and when Waldo questioned this, they responded with cold logic that it was natural, that it had always been this way. The winter of 1902 brought 3 months of snow that completely isolated the property. During those frozen months, the twins became a closed system, spending entire days together while deliberately excluding their father from their activities. They established routines that seemed designed to create a world containing only themselves. When spring melted the snow and made the roads passable again, Waldo traveled to town for supplies. The local merchant asked him about wedding preparations, and Waldo's confusion turned to dread as he learned that Phoebe had visited town weeks earlier, buying white fabric and speaking of a ceremony. The twins had made this trip without his knowledge, taking advantage of a day when he was working at the sawmill. Waldo confronted them that evening. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Phoebe and Wilbert, sitting side by side in the living room with expressions of absolute calm, explained that they had decided to marry, not to other people, to each other. They had reached this conclusion after months of studying their grandfather's books on genealogy, animal breeding, and heredity. They spoke of pure bloodlines, of important families in history who had practiced marriages between relatives to preserve special characteristics. They had thought through every angle, legal, practical, moral. If stories like this fascinate you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the sins of the past because what's coming will challenge everything you thought you knew about how far human beings can fall when they convince themselves that evil serves a higher purpose. Waldo exploded in rage, citing the Bible and the laws of nature, but the twins remained unmoved. They countered every argument with cold logic. They were adults. They were the only heirs to the property. Who in this isolated region would really care what happened on land this remote? They had discovered a legal loophole. Marriages performed on private property away from authorities were nearly impossible to contest when all parties were of legal age. The ceremony took place on a May morning in 1903 on the property grounds behind the house. No pastor, no guests, just Phoebe, Wilbert, and Waldo, forced to serve as witness to something that made his soul recoil. After the improvised ceremony, the twins moved into the main bedroom of the house as husband and wife. Waldo began avoiding the house during daylight hours, spending long shifts at the sawmill. At night, he locked himself in his room and tried to ignore sounds from upstairs. He began drinking heavily, trying to drown guilt and confusion in whiskey that burned but never quite numbed the knowledge of what was happening under his roof. The months that followed brought changes that should have alarmed him more than they did. The twins began modifying the house, installing extra locks on doors, covering windows with boards, digging something in the basement. When questioned, they spoke vaguely of preparing for the future, for the family they planned to have. They made strange purchases in town, massive quantities of non-perishable food, construction materials, items that suggested they were preparing for extended isolation. In the fall of 1903, it became clear that Phoebe was pregnant. The news brought no joy, only a heavy silence that settled over the property like fog. Waldo understood that any child born from this union would carry the weight of its forbidden origin, would be marked by the sin of its conception. During the pregnancy, the twins became even more withdrawn, rarely leaving the house, whispering constantly to each other as if always planning something. The first child was born on a stormy night in March 1904. Waldo was awakened by Phoebe's screams, but when he tried to enter the room, Wilbert blocked the door. He could hear his daughter's agony, could hear the baby's first cries, but he was not permitted inside. Hours later, when Wilbert finally emerged, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. The baby was a girl, he said. She was healthy. That was all Waldo was told. He was not allowed to see his granddaughter for weeks. When he finally glimpsed her, what he saw made his blood run cold. The infant was pale beyond normal, with eyes that seemed unable to focus properly, and limbs that moved with strange, uncoordinated jerks. But what disturbed him most was the clinical way the twins examined their daughter, taking notes in a journal, measuring her head circumference, documenting every aspect of her development with the detachment of scientists studying a specimen rather than parents caring for their child. Over the next several years, more children came. A son in 1905, another daughter in 1906, twins in 1907, and two more children in 1909 and 1910. With each birth, the modifications to the house became more extensive. The basement, which Waldo was now forbidden to enter, seemed to have been transformed into something else entirely. He could hear sounds from below, children's voices, yes, but also other noises he couldn't identify, scratching, moaning, sometimes screaming that was quickly muffled. The twins had essentially taken over the property. Waldo, now in his 50s and weakened by years of heavy drinking, had become a ghost in his own home. He worked the sawmill, sold lumber, and provided the family's income, but he had no authority anymore. The children, his grandchildren, though he could barely stand to think of them that way, remained hidden. He saw them only occasionally, always under the twins' watchful supervision, and what he saw filled him with horror. The children were not developing normally. They were pale and thin, with eyes that held no light. They moved with strange gaits, some crawling when they should have been walking, others walking with pronounced limps. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices sounded hollow, unused. It was clear they spent most of their time in the basement, emerging only rarely under strict control. In 1908, something happened that should have ended the horror, but instead only deepened it. Homer Mixon, a timber merchant from the next county, came to the property to discuss a large lumber order. He arrived in the late afternoon and stayed longer than expected. negotiating terms with Waldo while the twins remained upstairs. As darkness fell and Mixon prepared to leave, he asked to use the outhouse before beginning his long journey home. He never made it to the outhouse. What Mixon saw as he walked past the side of the house, a basement window that had been left uncovered, stopped him in his tracks. Later, piecing together what must have happened from evidence found at the scene, investigators determined that Mixon had knelt beside that window and looked inside. What he saw in the lamplight of that basement made him stand up so quickly he stumbled, made him start toward his horse with the clear intention of riding immediately to town to report what he had witnessed. He made it approximately 20 feet before Wilbert's axe caught him in the back of the skull. The killing was efficient, brutal, and clearly not the first time Wilbert had taken a life. He dragged Mixon's body into the forest that night, while Phoebe covered the window he had failed to secure. They buried the merchant somewhere on their 200 acres of land, a grave that was never found despite extensive searches years later. Mixon's horse was found wandering the road 3 days later, prompting a search that yielded nothing. People assumed he had been killed by robbers or had suffered an accident in the dense forest. The twins had gotten away with murder, and they knew it. More importantly, they now understood that their work could continue as long as they were more careful about covering windows and eliminating threats. The children in the basement became their entire focus. Waldo, on the rare occasions he caught glimpses of his grandchildren, saw that they were being subjected to something far worse than mere neglect. The oldest girl, now 4 years old, walked with a severe limp, and one of her arms hung uselessly at her side. The boy, born in 1905, had a pronounced intellectual disability, his eyes vacant and his movements clumsy. The 1906 daughter suffered from a curvature of the spine, so severe it left her hunched and in constant pain. But the twins documented everything with meticulous care. They kept journals filled with observations about each child's development, measurements, comparisons between siblings, notes on which defects appeared in which combinations. They had transformed their basement into a laboratory and their children into subjects, convinced they were conducting research that would one day be recognized as important. Phoebe, in particular, had become something inhuman. She examined her suffering children with the cold detachment of a scientist dissecting specimens. When they cried from pain or hunger, she made notes about their distress responses. When their physical abnormalities became more pronounced, she documented the progression with clinical precision. Maternal instinct had been entirely replaced by twisted curiosity. Wilbert had taken on the role of enforcer and protector. He monitored the property constantly, paranoid about anyone discovering their work. He installed more locks, covered more windows, created a system of barriers and warnings that would alert them to any intrusion. He also took responsibility for maintaining the specimens, his cold term for feeding the children minimal amounts and keeping them weak enough that they couldn't escape or cause problems. If that revelation just sent chills down your spine, hit that like button. This story is far from over, and what these twins did next proves that human depravity has no bottom. In 1910, Dr. Clarence Benson made a house call that would cost him his life. Waldo had developed a persistent cough that worried him enough to send word to town requesting a doctor's visit. Benson was a middle-aged physician known for his willingness to travel to remote properties to treat patients. He arrived on a clear autumn afternoon, examined Waldo's lungs, and prescribed rest and a tonic that could be purchased in town. But as he was preparing to leave, Benson heard something that made him pause. A sound from below the house, a child's cry, weak and pained, followed by another voice attempting to soothe it. Benson, who had delivered babies and treated children throughout the region, recognized the sound of suffering. He asked Waldo about the children. How many grandchildren did he have? Were they healthy? Waldo's response was evasive, mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. Benson's instincts as a physician told him something was very wrong. He insisted on examining the children, claiming it was standard practice when visiting remote properties to check on all residents. The twins initially refused, but Benson was persistent. He had medical authority on his side, and he made clear that he wouldn't leave until he had confirmed the children's well-being. Faced with the choice of allowing him access or forcibly removing a respected doctor from their property, which would certainly lead to investigation, the twins made a calculation. They allowed him into the basement. What Dr. Benson saw in that dimly lit space has been partially reconstructed from his medical bag. which was later found and contained notes he had started to write before he died. 7 children, ranging in age from 6 months to 6 years old, living in conditions that defied description. The oldest girl, unable to walk properly, lying on a pile of dirty blankets in a corner. 2 of the children showing clear signs of malnutrition, their ribs visible through paper-thin skin. Another child with a head shape that indicated hydrocephalus, the pressure of fluid in his skull, causing obvious pain. The twins in the basement, not Phoebe and Wilbert, but 2 of their children, both displaying severe developmental abnormalities. Benson's notes ended mid-sentence. Investigators later determined that Wilbert had struck him from behind with an iron bar, fracturing his skull. Phoebe had been the one to finish it, holding a cloth soaked in chloroform over his face until his struggles stopped. They had planned this together, working with the coordination they had developed over years of isolation and shared purpose. They buried Benson somewhere on the property, adding his body to the land's growing collection of secrets. His horse and medical bag were hidden separately, and when searchers came looking for him weeks later, the twins expressed polite concern about his disappearance, but provided no useful information. The investigation eventually concluded that he had likely been killed by robbers or wild animals while traveling between properties. 2 murders now. 2 men who had seen what was happening in that basement, both eliminated with cold efficiency. The twins had crossed a line that most people couldn't even approach, and they had done it without hesitation, because their work was more important than individual lives. By 1912, the situation in the basement had reached a crisis point. Several of the children were seriously ill, their weakened bodies unable to fight off infections. The oldest girl had developed pressure sores from lying in the same position for too long, sores that had become infected and were causing her agonizing pain. One of the younger children had stopped eating entirely, lying listless in a corner, slowly starving despite the minimal food offered. But the twins didn't seek medical help. They documented each child's decline with the same clinical detachment they had always shown. They took notes on the progression of symptoms, on how long each child lingered before death, on whether the suffering served any research purpose. They had become so disconnected from normal human emotion that they could watch their own children die and feel nothing but curiosity about the process. In late 1912, Waldo finally attempted to take action. One night, drunk enough to find courage and sick enough with guilt to finally act, he tried to enter the basement to see the children. Wilbert stopped him physically, and for the first time in years, Waldo fought back. The confrontation was brief and pathetic, an old, broken man against his strong son, but it was enough to alert the twins that he had become a potential threat. They began dosing his food with laudanum, keeping him in a perpetual fog of semi-consciousness. Waldo spent his last months in a haze, barely aware of his surroundings, occasionally mumbling about sounds from the basement and children who should never have been born. The property became entirely the twins' domain, a kingdom of horror hidden 15 miles from the nearest town, shielded by dense forest and deliberate isolation. What finally brought their reign to an end wasn't conscience or divine intervention. It was simple human error. In March 1913, a particularly harsh winter storm damaged part of the sawmill. Wilbert needed materials to repair it, materials that required a trip to town and a conversation with the lumber supplier about custom parts. For the first time in months, he had to leave the property for an extended period, taking the wagon and planning to be gone overnight. This left Phoebe alone with 7 children in the basement and Waldo in his laudanum-induced stupor upstairs. She should have been fine. The children were weak, the systems were in place, and she had managed them alone before. But that night, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. The oldest girl, now 9 years old, had been watching and waiting. Despite her physical disabilities and years of abuse, some spark of will had survived in her. She had been observing the patterns of when she was fed, when the basement door was locked, when Phoebe left them alone for extended periods. That night, when Phoebe went upstairs to check on Waldo, the girl made her move, using a piece of broken wood she had hidden for weeks. She managed to pry open the window that Homer Mixon had looked through 5 years earlier, the window that had been secured but never properly sealed because the twins were so confident in their control. The window was small, but the girl was emaciated enough to fit through it. She pulled herself up with her one functional arm, pushed through the opening and fell onto the ground outside. She couldn't walk properly. Her body was weak from malnutrition and years of confinement, but she could crawl. And crawl she did, through the darkness, through the forest, away from the house that had been her prison since birth. She made it almost 2 miles before a hunter found her at dawn. Thomas Garrett was checking his trap lines when he discovered the child collapsed beside a stream, barely conscious, her nightgown torn and filthy, her body bearing scars and deformities that made him recoil in shock. He carried her to his horse and rode immediately to town, taking her straight to the sheriff's office. What the child told them, in a halting voice unused to speaking, launched the investigation that would expose everything. She spoke of a basement with other children, of a mother and father who hurt them and watched them suffer, of men who had been killed when they tried to help. She described the location of the property with details that could only come from someone who had lived there. Sheriff William Hayes organized a group of deputies and concerned citizens and rode out to the Oats property that same afternoon. They arrived to find Phoebe attempting to clean the basement, destroying evidence, preparing a story, but she had only been alone for a few hours. The scene she was trying to conceal was too horrific to hide quickly. When the deputies entered that basement, several of them vomited immediately. The smell alone was overwhelming. Human waste. Infection, taupo, rotico, and something else. A stench of prolonged suffering that seemed to permeate the very walls. 6 children were found alive, if alive was the right word for their condition. They were arranged in different areas of the basement, some in makeshift cages, others chained to walls. One lying in what appeared to be an observation area complete with measuring tools and documentation. The condition of these children shocked even hardened lawmen. The second oldest boy, age 7, had such severe malnutrition that his bones were visible through his skin. Twin girls, age 5, both displayed developmental abnormalities that included partially fused limbs and facial deformities. A 3-year-old boy showed signs of repeated physical trauma, with scars suggesting deliberate injury. The youngest, only 2 years old, could barely move and didn't respond to stimuli. But what truly horrified the investigators was the documentation. The twins had kept meticulous records of everything. Journals detailing each child's conception, birth, development, and deterioration, measurements tracking growth abnormalities, clinical observations about pain responses and suffering, sketches showing the progression of physical deformities, notes comparing outcomes between different children as if they were experimental variables rather than human beings. Phoebe was arrested on the spot. Wilbert was apprehended when he returned the next morning, finding the property surrounded by law enforcement. Neither showed remorse. Both maintained that they had been conducting important research, that their methods were sound, that one day their work would be recognized as a contribution to science. Pause for a second and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you had been one of those deputies entering that basement? How do you even begin to process evil this calculated, this sustained over years? Waldo was found upstairs, barely conscious, mumbling incoherently about his grandchildren and the sounds he had heard from below. He was transported to a hospital where doctors confirmed he had been systematically drugged for months. He would never recover mentally from the trauma of understanding what had been happening under his roof, what he had failed to stop. The trial of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats became a sensation that drew attention from across the country. Newspapers published detailed accounts of the horrors discovered in the basement. Experts testified about the effects of inbreeding and the twins' complete lack of empathy. The prosecution presented the journals as evidence of premeditated, systematic abuse that had lasted nearly a decade. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming that extreme isolation had damaged the twins' ability to understand right from wrong. They brought psychiatrists who discussed the effects of growing up without normal social contact, the danger of insular thinking, the way isolation can warp moral reasoning. But the prosecution demonstrated that the twins' actions had been deliberate and planned. They had researched genetics and heredity, had studied breeding in animals, had made conscious decisions at every stage. They had hidden their activities, had murdered to protect their secrets, had showed clear understanding that what they were doing would be condemned by society. The journals themselves disproved any claim of incompetence. The entries were lucid, detailed, showing clear cause and effect reasoning. One particularly damning passage written by Phoebe described her decision to withhold food from certain children to observe the effects of starvation on development. Another entry by Wilbert discussed his calculation of how much force would be required to kill the doctor quickly and quietly. These were not the writings of people who didn't understand their actions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, 2 murders, multiple counts of child abuse, neglect, false imprisonment, and a catalogue of other charges. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. Even in their separate prison cells, men and women were housed in different facilities. The twins maintained their conviction that history would vindicate them. Phoebe wrote letters to scientists and academics, trying to share her research findings. Wilbert attempted to publish his observations in medical journals, seemingly unable to comprehend why no legitimate publication would touch his work. They died still believing they had been conducting important work, martyrs to a scientific cause that existed only in their twisted minds. The 4 surviving children faced prospects that could barely be called life. The oldest girl, who had found the courage to escape, spent the rest of her existence in institutional care, her body too damaged to recover. She never learned to walk properly, never developed beyond a limited understanding of the world, and died in her 20s from complications related to her early trauma. The boy with severe mental disabilities showed minimal improvement despite intensive care. He learned a few basic words and could perform simple tasks, but never gained the capacity for independent living. He spent his life in state facilities, a permanent reminder of what the twins had done. The youngest 2 children had even more tragic fates. One died within 2 years of rescue, her body too damaged to recover even with proper medical care. The other survived to age 15, but never adapted to the outside world, developing debilitating phobias that eventually contributed to his death during a severe panic attack. The twin girls, both displaying physical deformities from inbreeding, lived somewhat longer, but with such severe disabilities that their quality of life was minimal. They remained in institutional care until their deaths in their 30s, never experiencing anything remotely resembling normal existence. Waldo Oates never recovered from the knowledge of what his inaction had enabled. Committed to a state asylum after the trial, he spent his remaining years in a constant state of agitation, muttering about sounds from the basement and children who should never have been born. The staff noted that he would sometimes weep uncontrollably, sometimes scream about blood on his hands, sometimes just sit in silence, staring at nothing. He died in 1918, still tormented by nightmares about his family. The property itself became a symbol of horror. After the trial, it stood abandoned, the house where such atrocities had occurred left to deteriorate. Locals avoided it, telling stories about strange sounds that could be heard from the location, about how animals refused to go near the site, about how the very trees seemed twisted and wrong in that area. In 1920, the house burned to the ground. The official report cited lightning as the cause, but many suspected arson. Most people in Crater Lake preferred to believe the house had somehow destroyed itself, that the weight of the sins committed within its walls had become too much for the structure to bear. The bodies of Homer Mixon and Dr. Clarence Benson were never recovered, despite extensive searches of the 200-acre property. The twins took the secret of their burial locations to their graves, refusing to reveal the information even when offered sentence reductions. It was one final act of control, one last way to maintain power over the situation. Phoebe survived in prison until 1934, dying at age 50 from natural causes. Until her last breath, she maintained that her actions had been justified, that she had been conducting important research, that history would eventually recognize her contributions. Prison records show that she never expressed remorse, never asked about her surviving children, never showed any indication that she understood the monstrous nature of what she had done. Wilbert lived even longer, spending almost 4 decades in prison before dying in 1951 at age 67. Like his twin, he never showed remorse, never sought forgiveness, never stopped believing he had been doing important work. His last letter, written shortly before his death, was another attempt to have his research published, demonstrating that whatever had broken in his mind during those years of isolation had never healed. The psychological autopsies performed by modern experts on the twins, journals reveal a descent that began long before the actual crimes. The isolation of their childhood created a closed system where normal moral development couldn't occur, without external reference points, without contact with broader society, without exposure to diverse human experiences. They developed their own moral framework that justified the unjustifiable. Their grandfathers' books on genealogy and breeding, meant as academic texts, became the foundation for a twisted philosophy that confused selective breeding of animals with human reproduction. They convinced themselves they were conducting legitimate research, that their children were willing participants in an important experiment, that the ends justified any means. They created a complete system of rationalization that allowed them to torture their own offspring while believing they were serving a higher purpose. The journals also reveal the role of their initial decision to marry each other. That first violation of moral and social norms created a precedent that made subsequent violations easier. Once they had crossed the boundary of what was acceptable, once they had convinced themselves that society's rules didn't apply to them, each subsequent step became less difficult. The decision to have children despite knowing the risks of inbreeding led to the decision to hide those children from view, which led to the decision to treat them as experiments, which led to the willingness to kill to protect their secrets. It was a cascade of increasingly grave sins, each one making the next seem less impossible, until they were capable of acts that would have been unthinkable to them in their youth. The isolation that had shaped their childhood became the isolation they imposed on their children, perpetuating trauma across generations in a cycle of abuse that only ended when one child found the courage to escape. The story of the Oats twins forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and moral accountability. Can isolation truly warp a person's sense of right and wrong so completely that they become incapable of recognizing their own monstrosity? Or were Phoebe and Wilbert fundamentally broken in ways that isolation merely revealed rather than created? The evidence suggests both factors played roles. Their unusual childhood created conditions that prevented normal moral development, but their choices as adults, the decision to marry, to have children, to hide and experiment on those children, to kill to protect their secrets, were conscious decisions made by people who understood they were violating social norms, even as they justified those violations to themselves. They weren't insane in the legal sense. They understood the difference between right and wrong according to society's standards. They simply believed they were above those standards, that their research was more important than conventional morality, that they had discovered truths that exempted them from normal human obligations to their own children. This makes their crime even more disturbing because it removes the comfortable explanation of madness. They weren't mad. They were cold, calculating, and completely convinced of their own righteousness, even as they committed acts of sustained horror against helpless children. They represent a particular type of evil, rational evil, justified evil, evil that dresses itself in the language of science and progress while inflicting unimaginable suffering. The surviving children's lives stand as permanent testimony to the cost of this evil. 4 human beings who never had a chance at normal existence, who spent their entire lives dealing with physical and psychological damage inflicted by the very people who should have protected them. They never knew parental love, never experienced security, never had the opportunity to develop their full human potential because they were reduced to specimens in an improvised laboratory hidden in a basement. The legend of the Oats property persists in the Oregon mountains. Hunters who venture near the site of the old house report feeling an inexplicable unease, a sense that something terrible happened there that has left a permanent mark on the land. Trees in that area grow strangely, twisted and stunted, though botanists attribute this to soil composition rather than anything supernatural. Animals reportedly avoid the area, though wildlife biologists suggest this might be due to human scent markers left by previous investigators. But legends often contain truth even when they embellish facts. Something terrible did happen on that property. A decade of systematic abuse, torture disguised as research, murder to hide evidence, and the destruction of at least 11 lives, 7 children who were victims, 2 parents who were monsters, and 2 men who were killed for trying to help. The land absorbed that horror, and while it may not be literally cursed, it remains a place where one of humanity's darkest chapters unfolded in isolation and secrecy. If this investigation into generational sin and moral corruption fascinated you, Subscribe to the Sins of the Past and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates the dark truths history tried to bury. Next week, we're uncovering another story of sins that refuse to stay hidden. The case of a small-town doctor whose mercy killings in the 1920s revealed something far more sinister than euthanasia. Some debts demand payment, no matter how many years pass. The Oats twins and story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't supernatural beings from folklore. They're human beings who convince themselves that their version of morality supersedes basic human decency, who use isolation to hide their crimes, who document their own descent into evil while believing they're creating something important. The children who died and the children who survived both paid the price for their parents' sins, a generational debt that can never truly be settled. In the silent mountains of Oregon, where ancient trees still whisper secrets to those who listen, the legend of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats serves as an eternal warning that human capacity for evil has no limits when isolation and obsession combine. That moral accountability doesn't expire just because crimes were committed in remote locations. That the sins of the past demand recognition, remembrance, and the promise that we will never allow such horrors to remain hidden again. The mountains of Oregon still hold countless secrets beneath their trees, and the story of the Oats twins reminds us that some of humanity's darkest chapters unfold in the most isolated places, where screams are muffled by forest and suffering goes unwitnessed for years. But eventually every sin comes to light. Eventually, the buried truth claws its way back to the surface. Eventually, accountability arrives. Even if it takes a decade and the courage of a 9-year-old girl to escape hell and tell the world what she had survived.